I'm Johnny Chang, founder of the World of Waterfalls, and in this video, I'm going to talk about the Lower Fox Canyon Falls in Big Tahunga Canyon.
Lower Fox Canyon Falls, or Lower Falls of the Fox, is an elusive and hidden waterfall within Fox Canyon. That canyon itself is a tributary of Big Tahunga Canyon. This waterfall is known to well-equipped canyoneers who would rappel or abseil down Fox Canyon's many waterfalls, and this includes the Great Falls of the Fox, which is a tall waterfall further upstream of the Lower Falls of the Fox that I'm about to talk about here. Now, us mere mortals who like to hike to our waterfalls can still get to experience Fox Canyon's hidden gems, and that's where this video comes in. In addition to the adventure to Lower Fox Canyon Falls, you can also do a quick detour to experience the seasonal Josephine Creek Falls. Now, Lower Fox Canyon Falls is less visited for a reason, and that's primarily because there's a lot of risk involved to even reach this waterfall. Depending on your experience, you could even argue that Josephine Creek Falls itself carries some degree of risk as well. Now, just to give you an idea of what we had to go through, I went with my mom, who's game for an adventure like this, and we ended up taking about 5 hours away from the car. We definitely needed good grippy shoes as well as a good GPS and or GPS app to help keep track of where we're at. Anyway, this is basically a mostly off-trail adventure that involves cliff ledges, steep descents, a bit of bushwhacking, route finding, and wading in water. This doesn't even include natural hazards like landslides, ticks, poison oak, and prickly vegetation. So with this brief overview, let's get into the adventure description. This adventure starts from the Big Tahunga Canyon Road. Now for driving directions, please see the link to our write-up for this waterfall in the video description below. Right off the bat, you'll immediately see that the trail is very narrow and eroded in many places, and it makes me wonder how much longer this trail is going to last, given how there's easily fires in this area, as well as erosion from storms, and just natural erosion due to the steepness of the canyon. The trail leads to a pole with a view towards both the Tahunga Canyon Reservoir as well as the Lower Fox Canyon. Sometimes the reservoir level may be too high to even reach the Lower Fox Canyon because it might require swimming to even get into the canyon itself. And the view from this pole is a good spot to get that early indication of whether even getting into Lower Fox Canyon is feasible or not. The trail continues to cling to the cliff edges with some eroded parts, which can be a bit sketchy, especially if you're not an experienced hiker. Even Mom, who's pretty experienced from hiking with me a lot, was a bit worried about the condition of this trail, which you can see from her pace in this part of the video. Roughly a quarter mile into the hike, we reach this ridge where we might be able to get an early indication of whether Josephine Creek Falls is flowing or not. The right side of this ridge drops into the hidden canyon that Josephine Creek Falls is located in, and it's this hidden canyon that's the main reason why most people not in the know are not even aware that this waterfall exists. In fact, this trail is surprisingly maintained since most haphazard scrambling trails don't even have switchbacks, and they typically involve direct descents that further adds to the erosion and hence the danger of continuing to undermine the soil stability of the slopes. Speaking of the maintenance, there's even this inscription on one of the large boulders, which makes me wonder if the maintenance is done in an official manner by the Angeles National Forest Service, or if it's just a generous volunteer who's maintaining this trail. During the descent, we also can see Josephine Creek Falls, where you can really get a sense of how tall this 170, 180 foot waterfall really is throughout the stretch of the hike. Now, eventually, after around 3/4 mile or so, we reach this unsigned trail junction where we have to choose between continuing straight on the trail or taking the junction down to our right, which goes down to the foot of Josephine Creek Falls in another quarter mile. For the purpose of pursuing Lower Fox Canyon Falls, both routes have disadvantages. The direct way may be shorter, but it involves descending a very steep gully that is very slippery and rapidly eroding. We actually followed some local advice from someone who I met here a month ago, and we took his advice and took that route. But in hindsight, I would seriously reconsider doing that because scrambling this way further reduces the soil stability of the canyon walls, and who knows if I end up triggering or even being responsible for a landslide down the line. Now, if you choose to go down to the base of Josephine Creek Falls, while that path is a lot flatter and slightly longer, once you get to the falls, you then have to bushwhack your way downstream to the Big Tujunga Canyon River. Now, this bushwhack is also neither obvious nor easy because you now have to contend with stabbing yucca plants, poison oak, and even ticks, which is always a risk whenever you go off trail and go bushwhacking. For now, we're continuing with the Lower Fox Canyon Falls adventure, and we'll come back to Josephine Creek Falls later. So beyond this junction, it didn't take long before the trail started getting steep really quickly. And it seemed to get steeper the further down we went, even though visually it didn't look all that bad as we initially went down. Now, by the way, this is one way people get into trouble and need to get rescued when they descend something and end up either unable to continue or can't seem to get back up. Now, during this descent, we got to a point where we had to pretty much sit and scoot our way down, given the loose, slippery soil. And in my case, I even did a baseball slide to finish this descent. Once we got to the bottom, we were then at the Big Tujunga River, where we then had to cross the river and find our way downstream as we headed towards Lower Fox Canyon. At this point, there is no trail, and it's pretty much following any used trails from people who might have been here before, or just trying to find any clearings since this section went back and forth between bushwhacks and clearings. We could tell there were people who have been down here before because we notice evidence, for example, a ring of sandbags in one stretch. There was also what I'm guessing is a wildlife camera further downriver on the canyon that we also happened to chance upon as we went by. Eventually, we got to a point where we had to go right back into the Big Tujunga River to avoid more bushwhacking. After maybe another half mile to 0.6 of a mile of scrambling at the bottom of the canyon, we then eventually reached the mouth of the Lower Fox Canyon. From here, we then had to continue our trailless scramble for about another 0.4 of a mile upstream to reach the foot of the Lower Fox Canyon Falls. Now, this scramble was pretty much involved a lot of route finding since there wasn't an obvious trail to follow. So we often found ourselves doing stream scrambling, then some bank scrambling on some very loose sandy embankments, in addition to bushwhacking, as well as dodging some of those stabbing yucca plants, and we even had to do a traverse of a landslide. We probably crossed Fox Creek at least 3 or 4 times in this 0.4 of a mile, but when you're already this deep into this adventure, you're probably not counting number of creek crossings anymore. So we eventually made it to the Lower Fox Canyon Falls, which had a healthy flow at the end of a dry January, at least when I captured this footage. And now that followed a very wet December where the last of the saturation storms ended in the last week of the year. So that should give you an idea of how long this waterfall lasts. Now, since we did show up in the winter, we noticed that the views were a little less obstructed since the trees didn't have leaves on them anymore. I'd imagine later in the year, like in the spring, the leaves will have sprouted, both on the trees as well as on the plants closer, sitting closer on the canyon floor. And that might make it a bit harder to experience this waterfall under those circumstances. In fact, there might even be more poison oak, which ups the risk of doing this hike, in addition to the the viewing nuisances. Now, once we had our fill of the lower Fox Canyon Falls, we then had to make our way back out, which was pretty much the same way we came in. That said, we did lose the path that we had taken on the way in, especially back at the Big Tahunga Canyon, and so we ended up bushwhacking a lot more than we did on the way in. Eventually, we got back to the mouth of the ravine containing Josephine Creek, and it was here that we tried to avoid going back up that steep and eroded scramble that we had taken earlier to get down to the river. But as we bushwhacked around, looking for an easier way to get to Josephine Creek Falls, we eventually gave in and were unsuccessful doing that because the overgrowth was just too thick for us to comfortably proceed in this manner. So we took another risk by going back up the steep and slippery and eroded slope that we had gone down earlier. And fortunately, we had pretty grippy shoes to successfully get back to the unsigned trail junction that we had departed from near the start of the hike at around the 3/4 mile point from the trailhead. And so we then followed the 1/4 mile path down to the foot of Josephine Creek Falls, where we then finally got to enjoy this spot before finishing the hike. Now, as you can see here, Josephine Creek Falls is seasonal, and it wasn't doing very well, as you see in this footage right here. Matter of fact, this footage was taken in late January, which was about 4 weeks after I first came here. Here's how it looked on New Year's Day in 2022, which gives you an idea of how quickly this waterfall disappears. And even though Josephine Creek Falls may be somewhat hidden and obscure, it's not free of litter, and I'm sure the graffiti will come as more people figure this place out. So that kind of gives you an idea of the ethics or lack thereof from the people who have already been here and kind of already started trashing the place. Now, regarding things like this, I guess when it comes to wilderness and environmental ethics, it's not really ingrained in us in school, and the way we make our money kind of flies against science. I guess you do get behavior like this, and it goes to show you how much of a systemic problem this is. Anyways, once we had our fill of this spot, then we went back up the same trail that we had come down on, which feels considerably easier on the way back after what we had gone through on this adventure, even though the trail is still narrow and eroded, but I guess we were now mentally conditioned to it, and we also had confidence in our footing and our footwear. So I hope this adventure video for the Lower Fox Canyon Falls gives you an idea of how, even for experienced hikers, it can be dangerous. While I definitely get the desire to get away from the crowds that are now plaguing the easier, more accessible waterfalls, just realize that you really have to be cognizant of what you're getting yourself into, because your safety, as well as those you bring with you, is ultimately your own responsibility.
All right, that's it for this video. If you like this video, please hit the like button or the subscribe button down below, and that lets me know that it's worthwhile to keep on making these type of videos and to show you the beautiful waterfalls that we've been chasing in Southern California, as well as the rest of the world. So in the meantime, be safe, have fun out there, and keep on chasing waterfalls.